not going to go too long, but man, we could go long talking about this project. There's so many avenues of discussion. I think the most obvious starting point is you guys aren't technologists, you're filmmakers. So when you first heard about this opportunity to basically witness somebody trying to use technology to kind of replicate the filmmaking process or some aspect of one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, what did you think? I mean, how did that strike you given your own relationship to the medium?
Yeah, go ahead, Dre.
That's a big loaded question right there. You know, I mean, when we were first approached about this project, you know, I mean, the first call we had was, you know, are you guys interested in documenting a project where we would essentially use artificial intelligence to try to, you know, look at and understand the work of Federico Fellini, and in the process, create a short film that's sort of, you know, inspired by his work with these tools. And we were immediately like, well, that sounds incredibly complex and interesting. So we jumped on it, obviously. And then we hung up the phone, and then I think we started asking ourselves a lot of big questions. Like, is that okay? Like, what does this even mean? What are we talking about? You know, to sort of, you know, replicate the genius of, or to carry on the legacy of a great filmmaker, you know? So there's different ways that we were talking about it early on. And the conversations were endless, and they're still going. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a Pandora's box when you really dig into it.
Well, and the other thing that's striking about the film is that you're not just watching people try to pull this off. You're also bringing in some expert voices to kind of help think this through. So, I mean, how did you sort of approach that part of it? You know, how did you sort of determine these are the important perspectives that we need in order to kind of cut through this thing and understand kind of the bigger picture ramifications here?
We brought one of those experts with us right here, Dr. Emily Spratt, who helped us. Hi, Emily. Who just follows us around every time we talk about this film, just to be our check, or whatever. So it was hard because I think there's a lot of fragile, fraught areas to kind of fall into when it comes to this kind of technology. So you don't really want to make something like AI comes with a lot of baggage these days, especially in like the world that we live in. People are talking, you know, there's a lot of things that create issues for when it comes to this kind of technology. So I think we were trying to, like, instead of trying to shy away from that, I think we tried to lean into it and tried to like ask questions that were maybe more controversial than I think the originators of this idea thought it would be. And I think this film became more than just a film about, you know, a fun little art project, experimental art project. It became a conversation about creativity and authorship and all the kind of, you know, bigger issue conversations that come with, you know, AI and sort of this, like the evolution of technology and filmmaking and storytelling and art and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so what surprised you about this process as it continued to evolve? Because it's one thing to say, we're just going to push this button here and see what comes out on the other side, but this clearly evolved into a very ambitious undertaking with a filmmaker who you capture here, who himself is sort of this interesting character in the narrative of trying to make something creative out of what a computer is telling you to make.
Yeah. I think the big takeaway is that we're not going to be replaced by AI anytime soon. I think the technology is much more of a tool than its own like entity. I mean, I think we all kind of anthropomorphize AI. Yeah. Thanks, Emily. And you know, we even did this. I mean, we fell into some of these traps at the very beginning of the project where we're like, well, what does the AI look like? The AI doesn't look like anything. It's just an algorithm and it's technology. So it's like a, you know, so I think what we learned with it, these are tools, and they're tools that are available to kind of anybody. And if you use them the right way, they can be really beneficial and helpful. And I think that was a process for us to go through ourselves, is just trying. I mean, we were brought on to document the process of making the short film.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we were trying to do was, just like an audience, learn as we were experiencing the short film being made. And we were trying to figure out what the short film was going to do as they were dealing with production issues and things like that. So I think that what we saw was a lot that the AI could be used in some ways, but it couldn't be used in others. And I think that was actually really, in a way, really interesting, because it can be used as a tool. I mean, I think that's what the big takeaway was, is like, this is a tool for people to like kind of expand creativity with. Yeah.
Explain a little bit more about that, because you talk about the AI can do some things but not other things. So let's get into the details a little bit there, because we know a bit from what you've documented here that we know, for example, the mouth filled with millions of eyes was an AI concept, but then there are other things that had to be human in origin.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this was it was an experimental art project. And, if you look at how AI is being used in our everyday lives with, different apps that we're using, AI has been used, obviously a bunch over the last 5 to 10 years in sort of data mining and data, creating data sets and then figuring out how to learn from all that data. And I think what's unique about this is we're trying to figure out, like, is there a creative application for artificial intelligence? And sort of, in what capacity could we use it? And so in many ways, this is sort of like a proof of concept where, the developers use these sort of off-the-shelf tools that, were developed in some cases for slightly different purposes. They'd repurpose them and then try to figure out how to apply them to filmmaking, which is pointed out in the film, which is, it's a complex endeavor, right? I mean, to write a script, to then visualize that script, and then to go out, shoot it, and then to edit it. So along the way, I think what was interesting was, looking at how the script writing tool, for example, was, used by Max, the short film director, as almost like a creative collaborator, where Max was like, okay, I'm not so sure I'm feeling this character who's outside at the parade. So he's like, okay, so are there other options? And you literally press the like go button and it gives you some ideas. Right. So the algorithm was analyzing the script up to that point, and the algorithm had in it, knowledge from all the scripts that it had previously analyzed. And so it started giving him suggestions. Some suggestions he was like, oh, that's totally not going to work. And one suggestion was the Admiral, the guy in the white that you guys see in that parade scene. And Max thought, oh, that guy could be great. That could be a really interesting character. Another example was, dialogue, like the millions and millions of eyes. And so there's this, interesting mouth of truth character. And he's like, well, what's he going to say? Or what's she going to say? And so you could imagine, in the next couple of years, our sort of screenwriting applications and screenwriting software having a feature in it where there you are, you're writing your script and you kind of say like, all right, I kind of need I want to stir the pot a little bit, right? I want to mix this up. And you kind of hit the like, what would you say, AI?
What would Fellini do?
What would Fellini do, right? And so you could imagine how these tools could be developed further.
Once you get past the that kind of existential question that some people raise, if it's just scary, is this going to take my job? It becomes more sort of a platform for how somebody does their job in a new way.
Well, I think to Emily's point in the film, where she says, look, it's great if the AI wants to come up with 5 suggestions for you, but at the end of the day, she's like, it's kind of cutting the legs off of the imagination a little bit. Like, we should be coming up with those ideas. And so there is an argument to be made for, is it just this creative collaborator because you just don't have one? Or is it because the AI is actually going to be able to see something or know something that, we may not know? And I think that's the potential power of it. But then on the flip side, the potential pitfall is that we could get sort of lazy, right? And kind of just like, I don't know, what's the machine have to say? So,
Right. And the other thing I think is really fascinating about it is that if you think about it in the larger context of what we're looking at, it is a collaboration in part because the filmmaker is voluntarily doing this thing that he still has to solve a creative problem for. He's not just sort of at the mercy of the machine. He's using the bits and pieces that he's been provided for. He still has to mold something. So it's a new kind of clay in a way. I mean, and you see that in the way that he's solving problems. And I'm curious about the most immediate part of the process, which is being on the set. You've been on a lot of sets before. How different did it feel here when, everything from shot lists to, script notes and stuff had this other variable in play?
Well, what about, you would tell about the scene that didn't make it in here? What's the scene? So there was, I think we were in our third day of the short film production, and we were getting ready. The parade scene was the following day, and the weather report had come out, and it was going to storm. And so everybody is scrambling. Everybody's worried. How are we going to shoot this parade scene? The rain's coming. And we're like, the producers everybody's, concerned. It could cost a lot of money to push it and reschedule. And then we were like, gosh, maybe. And Zack and I, of course, were like, what would the AI do? And it's like, and they're like, well, the AI is not totally set up to deal with weather and budget challenges. And we're like, well, of course not. But what if you need to rewrite the scene? Like, how can the AI be used to adapt to a sort of on-the-fly challenge that presents itself, which happens on every film production? And so, in that sense, I think it was pretty exciting to kind of like try to put it to that real-world test. And ultimately, it came up kind of short, and the guys tried. I mean, they ran that parade scene through the AI. We filmed it. And in the end, they were like, it's okay. It's not the greatest alternative. And then luckily the next
It didn't
morning,
rain. That was the end of the story.
We'll never know until the next
and
project.
So then it didn't make the cut in the documentary because it wasn't exciting enough.
What about the sort of the big finale? I mean, what was that whole part of the shoot like? Because we see bits and pieces of it. They look very relieved at the very end. Everyone's embracing and so forth. So.
But it's also, this was our film, which you guys just watched, is a film about another film that's being made that's also being written by a computer. So there's a lot of meaning we were a lot of people. And so there was I'm sure a lot of relief when that production once everybody got through production, because it was an army to make this. I mean, it takes a lot of people just to make a narrative film. It takes a lot of people to make a documentary film, and we just doubled down and just made them all at once. So I'm sure there was some relief. There was the whole weather challenge, which I think stressed everybody out. The documentary filmmakers were like, "This is great. Let's get more of this stuff." But I think for the film crew, it was hard. And so, I'm sure there was relief. Filmmaking is really hard. At the end of the day, every film you see, good or bad, that was somebody cried at the end.
Yeah. And I think in many ways it's a testament to Campari. I mean, for Campari to support a project like this says a lot. I mean, this is the kind of project where nobody knew if this was gonna work or not. It was hard to see where this would even go. I mean, talk about a risk, and for a brand to get behind a project of this kind of caliber and size and scope, I mean, it says a lot. And it was just so great that, originally this project was supposed to, be part of the 2020, the 100-year sort of celebration of Fellini's birthday, a celebration of Campari's 160th year. And of course, all that got put on hold with COVID. But for them to, continue to stand behind it, I think was a real testament, because it was we've worked on a lot of projects and we've documented a lot of, different types of experiments. And this was by far, the deepest, most complex, project that we were a part of.
Well, and on that note, I want to also ask you about the Fellini aspect of it, specifically that you have the family blessing, on camera. It's part of the project is really showing that this is authorized in a way. How important was the sense you got that had to happen in order for this project to basically be what it was?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you'd make this project without Francesca as a part of it. for us, we came on and Francesca was involved already, and I think that was just kind of like what we needed to feel comfortable. I mean, what a crazy thing to try to do as like a filmmaker, is like make something in Fellini's voice and document a project about Fellini on his 100. It's like so much pressure, and so much like, you know, every filmmaker and every human on earth knows what a Fellini film is in a sense, and so it's just so much weight on that name. Francesca made that very easy and made that process like feel just like I don't know, just feel very natural. So
well, and then the other part of that I think is worth looking at is, you know, how much of a Fellini fan do you really need to be to participate in this process? I mean, it's one thing to feed in all these different minutia of his filmmaking style and the way the characters talk, the language of the script, but then to hand that over to somebody, I mean, the filmmaker that we see, presumably he likes Fellini movies. You know, that's sort of, we would say that's an important starting point, but just how essential is it to have that in your headspace as you're making a movie when the computer's already done this other stuff?
I mean, in some ways, I mean, Fellini was almost like the perfect filmmaker to sort of be the muse of this project, right? I mean, for someone who, you know, the veil between sensory reality and imagination is so thin, you know, for somebody who lives so often in his imagination and you see it on screen in every one of his films. I mean, in many ways, he was the perfect filmmaker to, you know, sort of be the impetus, you know, behind this project. And with that, I think, you know, we were all sort of inspired to go back and rewatch, you know, the many Fellini films we had seen and watch new ones that we hadn't seen yet. And so for all of that, it was a really sort of exciting journey, you know, and everybody sort of sharing anecdotes of different films and different scenes that resonated with each other. I mean, I heard the whole audience laugh, you know, during that moment in Satirico when, you know, all the guts are coming out of the pig. It's so visceral. And it's like, it's those moments that I think have really captured the imagination of audiences for 50 plus years with Fellini's work. I mean, you know, and that was exciting.
Any Fellini film moments that stood out to you during that deep dive?
From his actual films,
From the real ones, yeah.
I mean, I've definitely admit that I like had only seen 8.5 and Dolce Vita before to this project, and like watching like Clowns. I mean, these are some weird, crazy movies that this guy was making. Like no, you know, like. The part of the project was ingesting the scripts of Fellini's work, which were A, incredibly difficult to get, and B, don't really exist because he'd write something, but then like throw it out the window as he was making stuff. So they had to manually transcribe all of his films in order to give the AI something to actually respond to. And that's how, like, there's a real conversation about what the short film would be if it had been, you know, somebody far more sort of, you know, I don't know, what's an equivalent, like a Spielberg or something like that. Like somebody who's just working off scripts and comes from a very sort of like storyteller first, where Fellini was coming from a very emotion first point of view, I think. And so it might have been a very different project. But yeah, I mean, Fellini was making some wild films, really, really interesting. I mean, Amarcord is a very, very weird film. Julia the Spirits. I mean, I don't even know a little bit of, like, if I had to describe the plot of that film, I'd have a hard time.
Much less get a computer to figure out
Yeah,
what
exactly.
it's doing. I do think it's notable that the last person we hear from in your movie is Fellini himself, that you kind of give him the last word on all this. And not that, you know, you spend a lot of time kind of evaluating his backstory or who he was as a person, but do you get a sense of how somebody like that would respond to a project like this? Would he like that this is happening?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's such a loaded question, right? And it's an unfair question. And we asked Francesca that question because she's the closest to him, right? And her honest answer was, and this is why she agreed to participate in the whole project, because she honestly felt that her uncle would be very excited about this possibility, and very sort of curious, really, about this kind of collaboration with a machine. What could the result be if a human filmmaking team were to collaborate with AI? And so, in her words, she thought that he would approve in that sense. And I think for us, when we were going through all the archival and looking at all the interviews of Fellini over the years, we were trying to get at sort of, his inner world a little bit. How does he sort of think and feel about his own work or about his position in the world and about his art? And we came across that clip in the end, which we thought was just so interesting and powerful. And he's responding to, that interview's from the early 60s, and he's talking about cinema. He's talking about film, and he's saying how film can be used in potentially negative ways or positive ways, that film itself has this power. And so in many ways, I think you see this evolution happening with the power of AI. And so we just thought it was kind of a sort of an interesting way to end the film, sort of, from his point of view in some ways, if we could sort of create that.
You asked about the films that we had watched, but I think the most sort of interesting thing that we did in the research process was how much like behind the scenes or interviews we watched of Fellini and like how he worked and him, on set, on a crane at like, in Rome, making his films, like, and how he would just like, he was talking throughout. The actress is doing something, he's telling her what to do. The sound is being dubbed in later. Some of the actors are not actors. They're just saying numbers out loud, which he would just dub voices over later. Like, it is a wildly almost impressionistic performance thing that he was doing. And I think that like that alone was so inspiring and so cool and weird and different than I think what filmmakers are kind of taught, which is you write a script, you dial it in really tight, you do storyboards, you like really kind of figure out what your thing's going to be, and then you go and make exactly that thing. And he's just a jazz musician. Yeah. Much different.
Yeah. And I think as documentary filmmakers, we kind of appreciate that because we have to kind of do the same thing. It's like we'll plan and we'll research, but like the day of, you have to kind of like, you have to be as nimble as possible. And what's interesting about him in all the archival that we were researching is that like he often would not talk about his own films. He'd be uncomfortable. He wouldn't know what to say when reporters would ask him, tell me about this movie and what were you trying to do? Because he was just obsessed with process. He was all about being in the process and trying to like discover this thing, this essence of our sort of human condition from one movie to the next, as bizarre as some of them may be. And so, I think there's sort of a deep respect for just kind of his sort of approach to the art form, and I think that was, real unique. And I think in some ways, this project forced everybody to sort of try to be in that moment a bit and kind of roll with the kind of uncanny aspect of working with algorithms that are making wild suggestions, for a film. So
that's the last thing I wanted to ask you about. Having witnessed this whole process up close, what you've made here is sort of like a proof of concept in a way for a way of working, or at least seeing what happens when someone tries to work this way. So if other filmmakers were inclined to try it, what do you think? Is it worth further experimentation with this particular kind of process before we get, further along to the, screenplay software you were suggesting earlier? Just what we see here, is this worth, are we onto something here?
I don't know.
Would you do it?
Would I do what?
Make a film that was actually from something like this?
Yes, but probably. Oh, it's a really hard question. I don't know. What do you got, Emily?
I think that really what this film heralds is the trend towards convergence in technology. And the fact is that the short film, you can't really tell that it is directed and involved with AI to the degree that it is. It's that it's seamless, that it's there, but you can't tell that it's there. That's what's happening with AI. It's converging where it's seamless in all of its applications and remains undetectable. And so that's already happening within the editing process of film, and surely that will continue on, but you might not know it's there. It's not a binary as to whether it's the AI or the human. It's about this connecting in interwoven sort of way. And just while I have the stage, I will also add that I think that Fellini was ultimately interested in authenticity. It was the quest for authenticity. And so what this film, the documentary, challenges is it possible to really still own the position of authenticity as a director when using such tools? And so in this regard, I go against what my colleague Marcus Dusatoy says in the documentary, which is that actually the code should get authorship too. I would say that actually this is very much a human sort of endeavor, and that ethically we need to take responsibility for how these things are coming together in this seamless convergence.
Yeah, Dr. Spratt,
Bravo.
right? I mean, she's around to take any of your questions
I was
after.
gonna say, this is actually a terrific note to end on. I should let you know that we can continue this around the corner at the Leopard. So please join us. And
Thank you
we'll
guys
keep
for
going.
coming. Yeah.
Thanks for sticking around.
Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, New York Film Festival. Also, what a cool festival.